heart of downtown Chicago, where the pulse of the city thrummed through crowded sidewalks and towering skyscrapers, Raymond L. Hayes had carved out an unassuming existence. At approximately 75 years old, he was a fixture as familiar as the weathered benches outside the Chicago Public Library, yet as invisible as the shadows cast by the city's gleaming architecture. His tall frame, once robust with the vigor of youth, had grown frail with the passage of time and the weight of circumstance. His white hair, long and unkempt, spilled out from beneath a faded military cap that had long since lost its original olive green hue, now a patchwork of stains and frayed edges. The cap, like the man who wore it, bore the marks of a life exposed to the elements: sun, rain, snow, and the relentless grind of urban indifference. Raymond's army jacket, a relic from a bygone era, hung loosely from his bony shoulders. Several sizes too large for his diminished frame, it swayed like a tattered flag in the wind, its faded insignia barely discernible. The jacket, once a symbol of service and sacrifice, now served as a makeshift shield against Chicago's biting winters and the curious glances of passers-by. Beneath it, layers of mismatched clothing, donated sweatshirts, threadbare sweaters, and a pair of gloves missing half their fingers clung to his body, offering meager protection from the cold. Tucked beneath these layers, hidden from view, were a pair of dog tags, their metal edges worn smooth from decades of quiet existence, against his chest. The tags, like Raymond himself, carried a story no one bothered to read. Every morning, regardless of the weather, Raymond would make his way to his chosen spot outside the library. The bench, positioned just beyond the library's grand stone steps, was his unofficial throne, a place where he could sit in dignified silence, watching the world move around him. On sweltering summer days, when the asphalt radiated heat like a furnace, he would sit with his cap pulled low, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something lost. In the depths of winter, when snow piled high and the wind howled through the city's concrete canyons, he would brush the ice from the bench with a gloved hand and settle in, his breath forming faint clouds in the frigid air. The library staff, accustomed to his presence, had long since stopped asking him to move along. Some, moved by quiet compassion, would nod in greeting or leave a cup of coffee on the bench's armrest during particularly brutal mornings, a small gesture of humanity in a world that often looked the other way. Unlike many of the city's homeless population, Raymond never panhandled. He didn't hold a cardboard sign scrawled with "Please for help," nor did he approach strangers with outstretched hands. His pride, weathered but unbroken, kept him from begging. Instead, he maintained a quiet dignity that set him apart. His days were spent in solitude, his only companion a small, tattered notebook he kept tucked inside his jacket. The notebook, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges, was a repository of thoughts. Raymond would write in it with a pencil stub he kept tucked behind his ear, its lead worn down to a dull nub. His handwriting, shaky but deliberate, filled the pages with fragments of thoughts, half-remembered names, snippets of old songs, or descriptions of places he might have once known. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like the ramblings of a man lost to time, but to Raymond, it was a lifeline, a way to anchor himself to a past that grew dimmer with each passing year. The library staff, over the years, had grown fond of Raymond in their own quiet way. They noticed how he would sometimes pick up books left on the outdoor return cart, his fingers tracing the covers as if they held secrets only he could unlock. He would open them carefully, his eyes moving methodically across the pages, absorbing the words with a reverence that suggested a mind still sharp beneath the weight of his circumstances. He never kept the books, always returning them to their place with the same care he'd shown in opening them. On occasion, a librarian might catch him reading a biography of a long-forgotten general, a dog-eared copy of Hemingway, or even a children's book with bright illustrations that seemed to bring a fleeting softness to his weathered face. These moments were fleeting, but they hinted at a man who had once been more than the sum of his tattered clothes and silent vigil. Raymond's presence outside the library was so constant that he'd become part of the city's landscape, as unremarkable as the pigeons that flocked to the plaza or the street vendors hawking hot dogs on the corner. Yet, there was something about him that lingered in the minds of those who took the time to notice. A young barista at the nearby coffee shop, who saw him every morning on her way to work, once remarked to a coworker that Raymond had eyes like someone who's seen too much, but still hopes for something better. A janitor at the library, who'd served in Desert Storm, felt a kinship with the old man, recognizing the military cap and the way Raymond carried himself, shoulders squared, even when the cold made his joints ache. These were small observations, easily dismissed in the rush of city life, but they were threads in a tapestry no one had yet thought to weave together. On a Tuesday in late January, the city woke to a light snow that dusted the streets like powdered sugar. The temperature had plummeted overnight, turning sidewalks into slick ribbons of ice, and sending most Chicagoans scurrying for the warmth of heated buildings. Raymond, undeterred by the cold, arrived at his bench as always. He brushed the snow from the seat with a slow, deliberate motion, his gloved fingers stiff from the chill. Settling onto the bench, he pulled his jacket tighter around him, the fabric doing little to block the wind that cut through the plaza. For a while, he sat in his usual silence, his breath visible in the air, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. Then, perhaps to generate a bit of warmth or to chase away the loneliness that clung to him like frost, he began to sing. The song was soft, barely audible over the hum of the city, a low, rhythmic cadence that might have been a military march from another lifetime. The words, if there were any, were lost to the wind, but the melody carried a haunting quality, like a memory struggling to surface. It was the kind of tune that might have once rallied soldiers through muddy fields or kept spirits high in the face of fear. To Raymond, it was a tether to a time when he had a purpose, a name, a place in the world. To anyone else, it was just the mumbling of an old man, out of place in the modern rhythm of Chicago streets. Unfortunately for Raymond, the library had recently hired a new security guard, a young man named Tyler Grayson, fresh out of a community college program and eager to prove himself. Tyler was diligent, perhaps overly so, and had been instructed to keep the library's exterior presentable to avoid deterring patrons. To him, Raymond's presence, his tattered clothes, his unkempt hair, and now his quiet singing, represented an unsightly blemish on the library's polished image. Tyler had noticed Raymond before, but today, with the snow keeping most patrons away and his supervisor due for an inspection, he felt compelled to act. He watched from the library's glass doors, his radio crackling with routine chatter, and decided that the old man's singing was a disturbance, a violation of the peace that needed addressing. Tyler stepped outside, his boots crunching on the snow, and approached Raymond with the cautious demeanor of someone unsure of what they might encounter. "Sir," he called, his voice firm but not unkind, "I'm going to need you to stop singing. You're disturbing people." Raymond didn't respond immediately. His song faltered, then faded, as he turned his head slowly to meet Tyler's gaze. His eyes, a pale blue clouded with age, held no defiance, only a weary resignation. Tyler, mistaking the silence for non-compliance, pressed further. "Sir, we've had complaints about loitering here. I need to see some identification." Raymond's movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he reached into the depths of his jacket. His fingers, numbed by the cold, fumbled for a moment before producing a heavily damaged plastic card, its surface scratched and faded from years of wear. The text, once crisp, was now an illegible blur, the photo barely recognizable as a younger version of the man before him. Tyler frowned, turning the card over in his gloved hands. "This isn't valid ID, sir," he said, his tone growing sharper. "Do you have anything else?" Raymond shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and returned his gaze to the horizon. Tyler shifted uncomfortably, his breath forming clouds in the air. He wasn't trained for this, not really. His academy courses had covered de-escalation and crowd control, but nothing about handling an old man who seemed more ghost than threat. "Sir, you can't stay here," he continued, reciting the script he'd been taught. "It's against city ordinances to loiter in public spaces. I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." The us was a stretch. Tyler was alone, but he'd already called for backup, a decision he now second-guessed as Raymond made no move to resist. To Tyler's surprise, Raymond complied without protest. He closed his notebook with care, tucking it inside his jacket alongside the pencil stub. Rising from the bench, his movements were stiff, his joints protesting the cold and the years of sleeping on hard surfaces. He stood, his height surprising Tyler, who hadn't realized how tall the old man was beneath the slump of his shoulders. Raymond didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply followed as Tyler gestured toward the library's entrance, where a patrol car was pulling up, its lights casting red and blue reflections on the snow. The officers who responded were a study in contrasts. Officer Daniel Jenkins, a rookie with just 6 months on the force, approached with the cautious energy of someone still learning the ropes. His partner, Officer Maria Salazar, was a 10-year veteran who'd seen enough of Chicago's underbelly to approach most calls with a mix of pragmatism and fatigue. Jenkins took the lead, repeating Tyler's request for identification and receiving the same unreadable card. Salazar, standing a few steps back, watched Raymond closely, her instincts picking up on the military cap and the way he stood, ramrod straight despite his age, like a soldier awaiting orders. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," Jenkins said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. He'd expected resistance, maybe a shouted protest or a drunken rant, but Raymond's silence was unnerving. The old man simply nodded, his expression blank, and allowed himself to be guided to the patrol car. Salazar opened the door, her eyes lingering on the dog tags that peeked out from beneath Raymond's collar as he ducked into the back seat. She made a mental note to mention it later, but for now, the call was routine, a vagrant causing a minor disturbance, nothing to warrant more than a citation and a night in holding. At the precinct, Raymond was processed with the efficiency of a system that had seen too many like him. His fingerprints were taken, smudged by the cold and the roughness of his hands. His photograph, captured under harsh fluorescent lights, showed a face etched with lines like a map of forgotten roads. He was assigned a court date for the following morning, a formality for charges of loitering and public disturbance. No one asked about the military jacket, the dog tags, or the notebook he clutched like a talisman. To the officers and clerks, he was just another homeless man, another name in a ledger of minor offenses. In the overnight holding cell, Raymond sat on a metal bench bolted to the wall, his posture unchanged from the library bench. The cell was cold, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair. Other detainees, a drunk muttering to himself, a young man pacing with nervous energy, filled the space with noise, but Raymond remained apart, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the bars. He didn't sleep, didn't speak, didn't move except to adjust the notebook in his jacket, ensuring it stayed secure. The world around him moved on, oblivious to the history he carried, the sacrifices he'd made, the life he'd lost to time and trauma. As the night wore on, the precinct buzzed with the usual chaos, phones ringing, officers swapping stories, paperwork piling up on desks. Raymond's case, unremarkable in the grand scheme of Chicago's legal system, was just another file in a stack, destined for a quick hearing and a quicker resolution. No one noticed the dog tags, the faded cap, or the way Raymond's fingers traced the edge of his notebook, as if committing its weight to memory. No one asked who he was, where he'd been, or what had brought him to this moment. To them, he was a vagrant, a nuisance, a problem to be processed and forgotten. But the universe, in its quiet way, had other plans. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in a hush that felt almost reverent. In a courtroom not far away, a judge prepared for another day on the bench, unaware that fate was about to weave a story no one could have predicted. And Raymond L. Hayes, silent and unassuming, carried the weight of a past that would soon shake the foundations of justice, memory, and human connection. The municipal courtroom in downtown Chicago was a crucible of routine chaos, a place where the city's minor transgressions were cataloged, judged, and dispatched with mechanical precision. On that frigid January morning, the room buzzed with the usual cacophony, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of whispered conversations, and the occasional cough or creak of a wooden bench. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old coffee and the faint mustiness of a space that had seen too many stories pass through its walls. Rows of defendants, shoplifters, traffic violators, public drunks, and a handful of homeless individuals charged with nuisance crimes sat in varying states of resignation or defiance, their fates tethered to the docket's relentless march. At the front of the room, Judge Nora Bennett presided over it all, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of petty grievances and procedural monotony. At 61, Judge Bennett was a courtroom institution, her 20-plus years on the bench earning her a reputation as a no-nonsense arbiter of justice. Her salt and pepper hair, pulled back into a tight bun, framed a face that rarely betrayed emotion. Behind her reading glasses, her eyes were sharp, scanning case files with the efficiency of someone who'd long since mastered the art of separating fact from noise. Her rulings were fair but firm, her demeanor a carefully cultivated shield against the emotional weight of the lives that passed before her. To those who filled the courtroom, attorneys, clerks, defendants, and spectators, she was a figure of authority, unyielding yet human, a woman who'd seen enough of the world's messiness to know that justice was rarely simple, but always necessary. The gallery was packed that morning, a mix of weary family members, curious onlookers, and a young legal intern named Sarah Martinez, who sat near the back, scribbling notes for her law school practicum. Sarah, barely 23, was a first-generation college student with a fierce determination to make a difference. Her notebook was filled with observations about courtroom dynamics, legal arguments, and the occasional doodle when the proceedings dragged. She watched Judge Bennett with a mix of awe and ambition, hoping to one day wield the same quiet power. For now, though, she was an observer, soaking in the rhythms of a system that felt both daunting and exhilarating. The morning's cases unfolded predictably: a shoplifter fined, a drunk driver sentenced to community service, a traffic violator pleading for leniency. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man in his 40s named Paul Delaney, flipped through his files with the disinterest of someone who'd prosecuted too many low-stakes cases to care deeply about any one of them. The public defender, a harried young woman juggling a dozen clients, darted between defendants, whispering last-minute advice. The bailiff, a burly man with a shaved head, kept order with a stern glance, while the court clerk typed furiously, her fingers a blur on the keyboard. It was business as usual, a well-oiled machine grinding through the city's minor sins. Raymond L. Hayes was the last name on the docket, a footnote in a morning of forgettable offenses. When his case was called Commonwealth versus Raymond L. Hayes, case number 47,293, the room barely stirred. The bailiff scanned the rows of defendants, spotting the old man seated near the back. Raymond didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the courtroom's peeling paint. The bailiff approached, his heavy footsteps echoing in the now quiet room. "They're calling you, sir," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, tapping Raymond's shoulder. The old man rose slowly, his movements stiff from arthritis and the cold night spent in a holding cell. His faded military cap sat crookedly on his head, his oversized army jacket swallowing his frail frame. As he shuffled toward the defendant's table, a faint odor of unwashed clothes trailed him, prompting a few spectators to wrinkle their noses or shift uncomfortably in their seats. If Raymond noticed, he gave no sign, his expression as blank as the snow-covered streets outside. Judge Bennett, engrossed in the case file before her, didn't look up at first. Her pen moved across a notepad, jotting down details as the clerk read the charges: loitering and causing a public disturbance, both minor misdemeanors carrying fines or, at most, a slap on the wrist. It was the kind of case she'd handled thousands of times, a routine matter that would be resolved in minutes. But as she flipped to the next page, her pen froze. The name at the top of the file, Raymond L. Hayes, hit her like a jolt, a spark igniting a memory buried deep beneath decades of courtroom stoicism. She adjusted her glasses, rereading the name as if it might change under scrutiny. Her breath caught, a small sound lost in the courtroom's ambient noise, but seismic in its impact. When she finally looked up, her face had drained of color, her usual composure replaced by something raw, almost vulnerable. "Your name is Raymond L. Hayes?" she asked, her voice trembling in a way that made the room go still. The question hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken weight. The prosecutor, who'd been half-dozing through the morning's proceedings, snapped to attention, sensing something unusual. The public defender paused mid-conversation with another client, her head turning toward the bench. Sarah Martinez, in the gallery, stopped writing, her pen hovering over her notebook as she watched the judge's face. Even the bailiff, who'd seen countless cases come and go, felt the shift, his arms uncrossing as he leaned slightly forward. The courtroom, so often a place of noise and distraction, fell silent, as if holding its breath for what came next. Raymond stood at the defendant's table, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. They were pale blue, clouded with age and exhaustion, but there was a depth to them, a quiet resilience that seemed to pierce the haze of his circumstances. He nodded slightly, confirming his name, but said nothing. His silence wasn't defiance or confusion. It was the stillness of a man who'd long since learned that words rarely change the world's course. Judge Bennett, however, was unraveling. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles whitening as she fought to maintain the professional detachment that had defined her career. But the name, the face, the military cap, they were keys unlocking a door she'd kept closed for over 50 years. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice softer now, almost intimate, "did you serve in the military?" The question was a lifeline, a bridge between the present and a past she could barely articulate. The courtroom's silence deepened, every ear straining to hear Raymond's response. The prosecutor, now fully alert, flipped open his file, scanning for details he'd overlooked. Sarah Martinez leaned forward, her notebook forgotten, her instincts telling her this was no ordinary case. Even the spectators who'd been fidgeting or checking their phones were riveted, sensing a story unfolding that transcended the mundane charges on the docket. Raymond's gaze, which had been distant, seemed to focus slightly, as if the question had pulled him back from wherever his mind had wandered. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice rough from disuse, like gravel shifting underfoot. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled the room. Judge Bennett set the case file aside, her movements deliberate, as if the paper itself was no longer relevant. "Where did you serve?" she pressed, her tone gentle but insistent, her eyes never leaving his face. "Alpha Company, 17th Special Forces Group, Pleiku Province, Vietnam," Raymond answered, his words mechanical, as if reciting a script etched into his bones. The response was precise, the kind of detail that survived even when other memories faded. The courtroom remained hushed, the weight of his words sinking in. Vietnam. Special Forces. A war that had shaped a generation, its scars still visible in the men and women who'd returned, and in those, like Raymond, who'd never fully come home. The prosecutor, now wide awake, straightened in his chair, his pen tapping nervously against his file. The public defender, sensing a shift in the case's trajectory, began jotting notes, her earlier distraction replaced by focus. Judge Bennett's hand moved to her robe pocket, her fingers closing around a small object she'd carried for decades. She withdrew it slowly, revealing a worn medallion wrapped in clear plastic, its edges smoothed from years of handling. The courtroom watched as she held it up, her hand trembling slightly. The medallion was unremarkable to most, a small, tarnished disc with faded engravings, but to her, it was a talisman, a relic of a moment that had defined her life. She stared at it for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line, before addressing Raymond again. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was rescued by a soldier from that exact unit when I was a child. He carried me 3 kilometers to safety during a mortar attack. I never knew his name, but I've kept his unit medallion all these years." The words landed like a thunderclap, shattering the courtroom's silence. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, heads turning as spectators processed what they'd heard. The prosecutor's pen stopped mid-tap, his jaw tightening. The public defender's eyes widened, her notes forgotten. Sarah Martinez, in the back, felt her heart race, her mind piecing together the implications. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a collision of past and present, a reckoning with history. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman named Linda who'd seen her share of courtroom dramas, sensed the moment's significance. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up Raymond's records with a speed born of instinct. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "our records confirm he is Raymond Lawrence Hayes, Staff Sergeant, honorably discharged in 1983. The confirmation was a spark, igniting a flurry of activity. Sarah, unable to stay silent, raised her hand hesitantly. When Judge Bennett nodded, giving her permission to speak, the young intern stood, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, if I may," Sarah began, clutching her tablet. "I accessed the military service database for my pre-law veterans advocacy course. Mr. Hayes received both the Silver Star and the Purple Heart, the former for leading an extraction of wounded soldiers under heavy fire, and the latter for injuries sustained while shielding fellow soldiers during an ambush." Her words were a revelation, painting a picture of a man who'd once been a hero, not the silent, tattered figure before them. The gallery erupted in whispers, the bailiff calling for order as Judge Bennett absorbed the information, her expression a mix of awe and sorrow. Bennett removed her glasses, revealing eyes that glistened with unshed tears. She leaned forward, her voice trembling as she spoke directly to Raymond. "When I was 8 years old, my family was caught in crossfire during a trip to visit relatives working at a medical outpost near the Vietnamese border. During the chaos, I became separated from my parents. A soldier found me hiding in a drainage ditch, terrified and alone." She paused, her throat tightening, her hands gripping the medallion as if it could anchor her to the memory. "This soldier carried me through active combat zones until we reached safety. He gave me this medallion and told me to stay brave. 2 days later, my parents found me at a field hospital. I never knew the soldier's name, just that he was from a special forces unit. But I remember his eyes." She studied Raymond's face, her gaze intense, searching for confirmation. "Those same eyes are looking at me right now." The courtroom was a vacuum, every breath held, every eye fixed on the old man who stood silently, his expression unchanged, but his eyes flickering with something, recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of a memory long buried. The prosecutor, now fully invested, scribbled notes furiously, his earlier apathy replaced by a dawning realization of the case's magnitude. The public defender, sensing an opportunity, began formulating a motion, her mind racing with possibilities. "Do you remember Cameron Bay, 1968? Judge Bennett asked, her voice barely audible, a plea wrapped in a question. "A little girl, separated from her family?" Raymond's brow furrowed, his mind straining against the fog of memory loss. Many children, he said vaguely, his voice low. We tried to help them all. The response was incomplete, but it was enough. Bennett nodded, a tear escaping to trace a path down her cheek. The medallion, still in her hand, seemed to glow under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, a symbol of a debt unpaid, a life saved, a connection forged in the crucible of war. The police officer who'd arrested Raymond, Officer Jenkins, sat in the gallery, his face a mask of discomfort. He leaned toward his partner, Officer Salazar, and whispered, "Did we just arrest a war hero?" Salazar, who'd noticed Raymond's dog tags the day before, said nothing, her expression a mix of guilt and respect. Sarah, still standing, continued her impromptu research, her tablet screen glowing with military records. "Your Honor, there's more," she said, her voice gaining confidence. After Vietnam, Mr. Hayes served as a training officer until his discharge. According to Veterans Affairs records, he worked as an interstate bus driver for nearly a decade afterward. Judge Bennett, struggling to maintain her composure, turned her attention back to Raymond. "What happened?" she asked, the question directed as much to him as to the courtroom at large. Sarah scrolled through her tablet, her fingers trembling with the weight of what she found. "There's a gap in his records after 1994, she said. "It appears he was involved in a serious collision when another vehicle struck his bus. He suffered significant head trauma. There are medical notes about memory impairment, particularly short-term recall and an inability to manage complex tasks." The revelation hung heavy in the air, a piece of the puzzle that explained Raymond's descent from decorated veteran to homeless defendant. A court officer, a Vietnam veteran himself, stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. "Your Honor, if I may, many vets from that era had their paperwork mixed up in the system. If he couldn't remember details correctly or follow up with the VA, he might have fallen through the cracks, especially with memory issues." The words were an indictment of a system that had failed one of its own, a system that Judge Bennett, in her years on the bench, had seen fail too many times. Bennett addressed Raymond directly, her voice steadying as she reclaimed her role as judge, if only for a moment. "Mr. Hayes, do you have any family we can contact?" Raymond shook his head slowly, his voice barely audible. "They're gone now," he said, offering no elaboration. The simplicity of the statement was a gut punch, a reminder of the isolation that had defined his life for decades. The prosecutor, recognizing the case's extraordinary turn, stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, given these circumstances, the Commonwealth would like to request a continuance to reassess the charges." Judge Bennett nodded, but her response was far from routine. "This court will suspend proceedings against Mr. Hayes immediately," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "He does not belong in the defendant's chair." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the bailiff calling for order as the weight of her words settled over the room. Officer Jenkins, still in the gallery, studied his shoes, his earlier confidence replaced by a sinking realization of his role in Raymond's arrest. The prosecutor sat down, his file forgotten, his mind grappling with the implications of what had just unfolded. Bennett continued, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Furthermore, I am personally recusing myself from this case due to the apparent connection between myself and the defendant." The announcement was unprecedented, a breach of protocol that left the court clerk's fingers frozen above her keyboard. But Bennett wasn't done. In a move that would be recounted for years, she stepped down from the bench, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow. The courtroom watched, stunned, as she approached Raymond, her small frame dwarfed by his height but radiating a quiet strength. Standing before him, Judge Bennett's professional demeanor melted away, replaced by something deeply personal. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice breaking, "I never had the chance to thank you properly. That medallion you gave me, I carried it through law school, through my first cases, through my appointment to the bench. When cases seemed impossible, I would hold it and remember what real courage looked like." Her words were a confession, a debt acknowledged, a life laid bare. Raymond stared at her, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. His hand moved slowly upward, not quite touching his forehead, but suggesting a salute, a gesture from a life he could only half remember. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said softly, the words a refrain from a time when duty was his North Star. "No one gets left behind." The phrase, simple yet profound, echoed through the courtroom, a reminder of the man Raymond had been, and, in some ways, still was. Judge Bennett nodded, her eyes shining with tears she no longer tried to hide. The medallion, still in her hand, felt warm against her palm, a bridge across decades, a testament to a moment that had shaped two lives in ways neither could have foreseen. The courtroom, still reeling, began to stir. Spectators whispered to one another, their earlier indifference replaced by awe. Sarah Martinez, her tablet now resting on her lap, felt a surge of purpose, her decision to pursue veterans' advocacy solidified in that moment. The prosecutor, his earlier detachment gone, began drafting a motion to dismiss the charges entirely, his pen moving with a newfound urgency. The public defender, sensing a rare opportunity, approached Raymond, offering her services despite knowing the case might no longer need her. Judge Bennett, regaining her composure, called for a 30-minute recess, her voice cutting through the rising chatter. "Contact the Department of Veterans Affairs Emergency Response Team," she instructed her clerk, her tone leaving no room for delay. "Tell them we have a priority situation involving a decorated Vietnam veteran. And find me someone from the Veterans Legal Aid Society." The clerk nodded, already reaching for her phone, her fingers trembling with the urgency of the task. As the courtroom emptied, Bennett did something even more extraordinary. She guided Raymond to her chambers, a private sanctum where judges rarely brought defendants. The bailiff, unsure whether to follow, exchanged a bewildered glance with the court officer, who simply shrugged. Sarah, at Bennett's request, was invited along, her tablet clutched tightly as she followed the judge and the old man down a narrow hallway. "You seem to know how to navigate the military databases," Bennett explained, her voice brisk but kind. "We'll need that." Inside the chambers, the air was quieter, the chaos of the courtroom replaced by the soft ticking of a wall clock and the faint hum of a heater. Bennett poured Raymond a cup of coffee, which he held but didn't drink, his hands trembling slightly from the cold or perhaps the weight of the moment. She sat across from him, her judicial formality abandoned, her eyes searching his face for traces of the soldier who'd saved her. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, "I'm going to help you. But I need to understand what happened after your accident. How did a decorated veteran end up homeless?" Raymond's response was slow, fragmented, his words pieced together like shards of a broken mirror. "Headaches started," he said, his voice halting. "Couldn't focus on the road anymore. Lost my commercial license. Then the apartment." He gestured vaguely, the chronology jumbled in his mind, the years blurring into a haze of loss and survival. Sarah, typing rapidly on her tablet, looked up. "I think I found something, Your Honor," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. According to VA records, Mr. Hayes was receiving disability payments until 1997, when they stopped. There's a note about failure to respond to certification requests and return mail marked recipient unknown. "Bureaucratic black hole," Bennett muttered, her frustration palpable. If he couldn't remember to update his address or respond to paperwork, he would have disappeared from the system. Sarah nodded, finishing the thought. Exactly. With memory issues, he'd have no way to navigate the red tape. The words were a condemnation, not of Raymond but of a system that had let him slip through its cracks, a system that had failed to honor the sacrifices of a man who'd given everything. Outside the chambers, word of the morning's events began to spread. A court reporter who'd witnessed the exchange from the gallery slipped out to call his editor, pitching a human interest story that was already taking shape in his mind. judge halts trial after recognizing homeless defendant as war hero. The call, made from a quiet corner of the courthouse, was the first ripple in a wave that would soon reach local news outlets, then national headlines. By evening, the story would be everywhere, with headlines like "Judge recognizes homeless man as soldier who saved her life," capturing the public's imagination. Back in the chambers, Judge Bennett sat with Raymond, the medallion resting on the table between them. She studied his face, searching for the young soldier who'd carried her to safety, the man whose courage had given her a future. Raymond, for his part, seemed overwhelmed, his silence not a refusal to engage, but a reflection of a mind struggling to process the sudden shift in his reality. Sarah, still digging through records, felt a growing sense of purpose, her earlier role as observer replaced by an active part in a story that felt bigger than any of them. The recess stretched beyond 30 minutes, the courtroom filling again with reporters, veterans advocates, and curious onlookers drawn by the growing buzz. Judge Bennett, preparing to reconvene, changed into her ceremonial robe, a rare choice reserved for significant occasions. She was joined by two representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs and a silver-haired man in a tailored suit, introduced as Colonel James Whitmore, retired, now with the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. The stage was set for something extraordinary, a moment that would redefine Raymond's life and challenge the system that had failed him. As the gavel fell, signaling the session's resumption, Judge Bennett addressed the packed courtroom, her voice steady but charged with purpose. "Before this court proceeds further, I wish to make a statement for the record. This morning's proceedings have revealed information of significant importance regarding the defendant, Raymond Lawrence Hayes." She gestured to Colonel Whitmore, who stood, his presence commanding as he confirmed Raymond's role in a classified 1971 operation, Rising Fog, an extraction mission that had remained secret until 2008. The revelation added another layer to Raymond's story, a reminder of the silent sacrifices made by men like him. Bennett continued, her words a call to action. Preliminary investigation confirms that following a traumatic brain injury in 1994, Mr. Hayes experienced significant memory impairment that likely prevented him from navigating the bureaucratic processes necessary to maintain his benefits and housing. The prosecutor, now fully awake to the case's significance, stood. "Your Honor, in light of these extraordinary circumstances, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Hayes with prejudice." "So ordered," Bennett responded, her gavel striking with finality. But she wasn't finished. This court will not stop at merely dismissing charges. A grave injustice has been perpetrated, not by any individual, but by a system that failed to recognize and support a man who risked everything in service to his country. The words were a rallying cry, a promise that Raymond's story would not end in the courtroom, but would spark change far beyond its walls. The VA representatives stepped forward, carrying a folder of documents. "We've begun emergency reinstatement procedures for Mr. Hayes' benefits," one explained. "Back payments will require additional processing, but we've authorized immediate housing and medical assistance." The announcements were met with applause from the gallery, a rare breach of decorum that Bennett allowed, her own eyes shining with emotion. The hashtag #HonorHayes began trending on social media, fueled by posts expressing outrage and admiration, a testament to the story's power to move hearts and minds. As the session drew to a close, Judge Bennett made one final announcement, her voice resolute. "This court will convene a special recognition session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. While I have officially recused myself from Mr. Hayes' case, I will preside over this session in my capacity as a private citizen and beneficiary of Mr. Hayes' courage." The words were a promise, a commitment to honor a man who'd been forgotten for too long, a man whose eyes had once told an 8-year-old girl to stay brave. The courtroom emptied, but the story was just beginning. Raymond, escorted not to a shelter but to a private room at the VA Medical Center, faced a future that, for the first time in decades, held hope. Judge Bennett, preparing for the next day's session, felt the weight of the medallion in her pocket, a reminder of the debt she owed and the justice she was determined to deliver. And Sarah Martinez, her tablet now a tool for change, knew that this case, this man, would shape her career and her life in ways she could scarcely imagine. The wheels of justice, so often slow, were turning, and Raymond L. Hayes was at their center, a silent hero whose story would echo far beyond the courtroom's walls. The echo of Judge Nora Bennett's gavel still lingered in the air as the courtroom began to clear, but the weight of what had transpired held everyone in a kind of suspended awe. Raymond L. Hayes, a man who'd been invisible to the city for over a decade, stood at the center of a storm that was rapidly growing beyond the confines of the municipal courthouse. The revelation of his identity as a decorated Vietnam veteran, coupled with Judge Bennett's personal connection to him, had transformed a routine loitering case into a moment of profound reckoning. The gallery, once filled with disinterested spectators, now buzzed with urgency, reporters scribbling notes, veterans advocates exchanging hushed plans, and ordinary citizens whispering about the injustice that had unfolded before them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Chicago in a quiet that seemed to mirror the gravity of the moment, as if the city itself were pausing to honor a forgotten hero. Judge Bennett, her ceremonial robe trailing behind her, led Raymond to her chambers, a move so unprecedented that it left court officers exchanging bewildered glances. The bailiff, a man who'd seen countless cases come and go, hesitated at the door, unsure whether to follow or stand guard. Sarah Martinez, the young legal intern whose quick research had helped uncover Raymond's military honors, clutched her tablet and followed at Bennett's request, her heart pounding with the realization that she was part of something historic. The chambers, a small, wood-paneled room lined with law books and framed certificates, felt like a sanctuary compared to the courtroom's chaos. A single window overlooked the snow-covered plaza, where the library bench, Raymond's former refuge, stood empty, a silent testament to the life he'd led. Bennett poured Raymond a cup of coffee from a carafe on her desk, the steam rising in lazy curls. He accepted it with trembling hands, holding the mug but not drinking, as if the warmth were enough. His eyes, those pale blue windows to a past he could only half recall, darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Bennett sat across from him, her judicial demeanor softened by a vulnerability she rarely showed. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice gentle but resolute, "I'm going to help you. But I need to understand what happened after your accident. How did a decorated veteran end up homeless?" The question was both a plea and a promise, a commitment to unravel the threads of a life that had been allowed to fray. Raymond's response came slowly, his words fragmented like pieces of a shattered mosaic. "Headaches started," he said, his voice rough and halting. "Couldn't focus on the road anymore. Lost my commercial license. Then the apartment," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely, his hands tracing circles in the air as if trying to grasp memories that slipped through his fingers. The chronology was jumbled, the years blurring into a haze of loss and survival. Sarah, seated at a small table in the corner, typed furiously on her tablet, her fingers driven by a mix of adrenaline and purpose. "I think I found something, Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. According to VA records, Mr. Hayes was receiving disability payments until 1997, when they stopped. There's a note about failure to respond to certification requests and return mail marked recipient unknown. Bennett's jaw tightened, her frustration palpable. "A bureaucratic black hole," she muttered, her words laced with disdain for a system that had failed one of its own. If he couldn't remember to update his address or respond to paperwork, he would have disappeared from the system. Sarah nodded, finishing the thought. Exactly. With memory issues, he'd have no way to navigate the red tape. The revelation was a gut punch, a stark reminder of how easily a man who'd once risked everything could be erased by administrative neglect. Raymond sat silently, his gaze fixed on the coffee mug, as if the conversation were happening about someone else. But his slight nod, almost imperceptible, suggested he was following, piecing together fragments of his own story as they emerged. Outside the chambers, the courthouse was coming alive with activity. The court reporter who'd witnessed the morning's events had already called his editor, his voice urgent as he pitched a story that was equal parts tragedy and triumph. Judge Halt's trial after recognizing homeless defendant as war hero. The call, made from a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby, was the spark that ignited a media frenzy. Within hours, local news outlets had picked up the story, their headlines blazing across screens and social media feeds. Chicago judge recognizes homeless man as soldier who saved her life. By evening, the story would go national, with networks like CNN and NBC running segments that juxtaposed Raymond's tattered military cap with grainy archival footage of Vietnam, a visual shorthand for a nation's forgotten promises. Back in the chambers, Bennett leaned forward, her eyes searching Raymond's face for traces of the soldier who'd carried her to safety. "Mr. Hayes," she said, placing the medallion on the table between them. "Do you remember giving this to me?" Raymond studied the small, tarnished disc, turning it over in his hands with a care that suggested it held meaning, even if he couldn't fully grasp it. "Sometimes things come back in pieces," he said slowly, his brow furrowing with concentration. "A village on fire, a little girl crying under a culvert, so many scared eyes." His words were vague, but they were enough. Bennett nodded, her throat tightening as she recognized the scene he described: the chaos of Cam Bay, the mortar fire, the terror of an 8-year-old girl lost in a war zone. "That was me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You told me to be brave. That help was coming. Then you carried me to safety." Raymond's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of recognition, a memory fighting to surface through the fog of his injury. "Just doing my job," he repeated, the phrase a default response when memory failed him, but also a reflection of the duty that had defined his life. "Your job saved my life," Bennett replied, her words heavy with gratitude. "And now perhaps I can help save yours." Sarah, still digging through records, uncovered more details that painted a fuller picture of Raymond's post-service life. After his discharge in 1983, he worked as a bus driver for nearly a decade, she said, her voice tinged with admiration. He was reliable, well-liked, until the accident in 1994. The head trauma changed everything: memory loss, difficulty with complex tasks, even basic organization. There's a note here about him showing up to the VA for appointments confused, unable to recall why he was there. The information was a roadmap of Raymond's decline, each detail a marker of how a hero had been reduced to a shadow by a system ill-equipped to support him. Bennett's frustration boiled over, her hands clenching into fists. "This is unconscionable," she said, her voice sharp. "A man who risked his life for his country, who saved my life, was left to fend for himself because of paperwork? Because of a system that couldn't be bothered to follow up?" Her words were an indictment, not just of the VA, but of a society that had turned its back on its veterans. Sarah, emboldened by the judge's passion, added, "There's a pattern in the records. Other veterans from that era faced similar issues: lost benefits, unprocessed claims, no safety net for cognitive impairments. It's like they were set up to fail." Raymond, listening quietly, nodded again, his hands still wrapped around the coffee mug. The conversation, though about him, seemed to exist in a space he could only partially access. Yet his presence, his silence, was a powerful reminder of the stakes. Bennett, regaining her composure, made a decision that would ripple far beyond the courthouse. "We're not just dismissing his charges," she said, her voice resolute. "We're going to fix this for him and for every veteran like him. This stops today." As the recess ended, the courtroom reconvened, its gallery now swollen with reporters, veterans groups, and curious onlookers drawn by the growing media buzz. The hashtag #HonorHayes was already trending on social media, fueled by posts expressing outrage at Raymond's plight and admiration for his heroism. Veterans organizations, alerted by the news, began mobilizing, their representatives arriving at the courthouse with offers of assistance. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of hope and anger, as if the room itself were demanding justice not just for Raymond, but for all those who'd been forgotten. Judge Bennett, now in her ceremonial robe, took the bench with a presence that commanded silence. Beside her stood two representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, their faces a mix of determination and unease, and Colonel James Whitmore, a retired officer with the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. His silver hair and tailored suit gave him an air of gravitas, but his eyes held the same fire as Bennett's, a shared commitment to righting a wrong. Before addressing the charges, Bennett made a statement for the record, her voice steady but charged with purpose. This morning's proceedings have revealed information of significant importance regarding the defendant, Raymond Lawrence Hayes. His service, his sacrifices, and the systemic failures that led to his current circumstances demand our attention and our action. Colonel Whitmore stepped forward, his voice clear and authoritative. After reviewing available records, we can confirm that Staff Sergeant Hayes was part of a classified operation, codenamed Rising Fog, in 1971. This mission involved the extraction of American POWs from a facility just across the Laotian border. It remained classified until 2008, meaning Hayes himself was never able to publicly acknowledge his role. The revelation sent a murmur through the courtroom, a reminder of the silent burdens carried by men like Raymond, whose heroism had been locked away in government vaults. Bennett continued, her words a call to accountability. Additionally, preliminary investigation confirms that following a traumatic brain injury in 1994, Mr. Hayes experienced significant memory impairment that likely prevented him from navigating the bureaucratic processes necessary to maintain his benefits and housing. The prosecutor, Paul Delaney, now fully awake to the case's significance, stood, his earlier apathy replaced by conviction. Your Honor, in light of these extraordinary circumstances, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Hayes with prejudice. So ordered, Bennett responded, her gavel striking with a finality that echoed through the room. But she wasn't finished. This court will not stop at merely dismissing charges. A grave injustice has been perpetrated, not by any individual, but by a system that failed to recognize and support a man who risked everything in service to his country. Her words were a rallying cry, a promise that Raymond's story would spark change. The VA representatives approached, carrying a folder of documents. We've begun emergency reinstatement procedures for Mr. Hayes' benefits, one explained, her voice professional but tinged with urgency. Back payments will require additional processing, but we've authorized immediate housing and medical assistance. The announcements were met with applause from the gallery, a rare breach of decorum that Bennett allowed, her own eyes shining with emotion. The VA's commitment was a start, but it was clear to everyone in the room that more was needed. Veterans groups, mobilized by the news, began coordinating support. By mid-afternoon, representatives from 3 organizations, the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and a local nonprofit focused on homeless veterans, had arrived at the courthouse, each offering resources, housing, medical care, legal support to restore Raymond's full benefits. Their presence was a testament to the community that had rallied around him, a community that had been waiting for a spark like this to ignite their efforts. A particularly moving moment came when a group of active duty service members in Chicago for training exercises arrived at the courthouse in full uniform. They stood at attention outside the entrance, their faces stoic, but their presence a powerful show of respect. Inside, the gallery swelled with their comrades, their uniforms a stark contrast to Raymond's tattered jacket, yet a reminder of the thread that connected them: service, sacrifice, and the unspoken bond of those who'd faced war's crucible. Bennett, sensing the moment's weight, made an unprecedented decision. "This court will convene a special recognition session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., she announced, her voice resolute. "While I have officially recused myself from Mr. Hayes's case, I will preside over this session in my capacity as a private citizen and beneficiary of Mr. Hayes's courage." The words were a promise, a commitment to honor a man who'd been forgotten for too long, a man whose eyes had once told an 8-year-old girl to stay brave. The gallery erupted in applause, the sound spilling out into the courthouse halls, where reporters scrambled to capture the moment for their evening broadcasts. That evening, Raymond was escorted not to a homeless shelter, but to a private room at the VA Medical Center, a clean, quiet space that felt worlds away from the holding cell he'd occupied the night before. Doctors began comprehensive evaluations of his physical and cognitive condition, their initial prognosis cautiously optimistic. While some memory deficits appeared permanent, specialized therapy might help recover fragments of his past and improve his quality of life. A social worker, assigned to his case, sat with him as he settled in, her notepad filled with plans to reconnect him with resources he'd lost decades ago. Raymond, still clutching his tattered notebook, nodded as she spoke, his silence not a rejection but a reflection of a mind adjusting to a new reality. Judge Bennett, after concluding court business, visited him at the medical center, the medallion in her pocket a constant reminder of their shared history. She found him sitting by a window, the city's lights reflecting off the snow outside. "Do you remember giving this to me?" she asked, placing the medallion in his palm. Raymond studied it carefully, turning it over several times, his fingers tracing its worn edges. "Sometimes things come back in pieces," he said, his voice slow but deliberate. "A village on fire, a little girl crying, so many scared eyes." Bennett nodded, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "That was me," she said. "You saved me, and now we're going to save you." The visit was brief, but it cemented a bond that transcended the courtroom. Bennett left with a renewed sense of purpose, her mind already turning to the next day's session and the broader changes she hoped to inspire. Back at the courthouse, Sarah Martinez stayed late, her tablet glowing as she compiled a dossier on Raymond's case, her research now a blueprint for advocacy. She emailed her professors, her voice shaking with excitement as she described the day's events, her decision to focus on veterans' law solidified. The courthouse, usually quiet at night, hummed with activity as clerks and advocates prepared for the special session, their work fueled by a shared belief that justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. The media frenzy grew, with national outlets picking up the story and social media amplifying its reach. The hashtag #HonorHayes trended alongside posts that shared Raymond's photo, a grainy image from his arrest, his military cap tilted, his eyes piercing through the years of hardship. Veterans across the country shared their own stories of bureaucratic neglect, their voices joining a chorus that demanded reform. Local politicians, sensing the public's mood, issued statements promising to review policies for homeless veterans, though their words carried the cautious tone of those wary of committing too soon. By the next morning, the courthouse was a focal point of national attention. The special session, announced by Judge Bennett, drew hundreds, veterans in faded caps, active-duty soldiers in crisp uniforms, reporters with cameras, and ordinary citizens moved by a story that had touched something deep within them. The gallery overflowed, with people standing in the halls, their faces a mix of hope and resolve. Bennett, not in her judicial robe, but in formal civilian attire, took the podium, her presence a bridge between the personal and the universal. Beside her stood Raymond, dressed in clean clothes provided by a veterans group, his posture straighter, a flicker of his old military bearing visible through the years of hardship. Bennett presented Raymond with something he'd lost decades ago, a properly documented identity. A team had worked through the night to prepare a complete package: birth certificate, social security card, military ID, and Veterans Affairs identification. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "on behalf of a grateful nation and a particularly grateful 8-year-old girl who grew up because of your courage, I return to you your identity and your honor, though the latter you never truly lost." Raymond accepted the documents, his hands trembling less than they had the day before, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that suggested he understood, at least in part, the magnitude of the moment. The session was more than a ceremony, it was a call to action. Bennett spoke of systemic failures, of veterans left to fend for themselves, of a nation that owed more to those who'd served. Colonel Whitmore outlined plans for a new initiative, Operation Hayes, designed to identify and support veterans with cognitive impairments who'd fallen through administrative cracks. The VA representatives pledged resources, their earlier unease replaced by a commitment to follow through. The gallery, filled with veterans who'd faced their own struggles, nodded in approval, their applause a demand for accountability. Outside, the active-duty soldiers stood at attention, their salute a silent tribute to a brother in arms. Reporters captured the scene, their cameras flashing as the story spread further, its impact rippling through communities and institutions. By afternoon, the Chicago City Council announced an emergency review of protocols for handling homeless veterans, a direct response to Raymond's case. The mayor's office issued a directive requiring police to check for military service before processing any homeless individual for minor offenses, a small but significant step toward reform. Raymond's story, though, was more than a catalyst for policy change. It was a reminder of the human cost of neglect, the resilience of the human spirit, and the power of recognition to heal wounds long ignored. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by his newly formed support network, a reporter called out, "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to be recognized after all these years?" Raymond paused, his mind working through the question with the deliberate pace of someone navigating memory's gaps. "I never came home looking for parades," he said, his voice steady, "just a quiet place to remember my brothers who didn't make it back. Now, maybe I can remember them properly." The words, simple yet profound, captured the essence of a man who'd never sought glory but had given everything for others. They echoed through the crowd, through the media, through the nation, a call to listen, to understand, to honor. Raymond's journey was far from over, but for the first time in decades, it held hope, a home, a purpose, a community that saw him not as a vagrant, but as a hero. And Judge Bennett, watching from the sidelines, knew that this was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a fire for justice, for veterans, for all those who'd been left behind. 6 months after the seismic courtroom revelation that had thrust Raymond L. Hayes from obscurity into the national spotlight, the city of Chicago bore subtle but indelible marks of his story. The once-unnoticed bench outside the Chicago Public Library, where Raymond had spent countless days in silent vigil, now carried a small bronze plaque in honor of Staff Sergeant Raymond L. Hayes and all veterans whose service must never be forgotten. The inscription, polished to a gleam, caught the morning light, drawing the eyes of passers-by who paused to read it, some lingering as if to pay quiet respect. The library itself had transformed into a hub of outreach, its staff launching a veterans resource program that offered books, job training, and referrals to housing and medical services. The program, spearheaded by a librarian who'd once left coffee for Raymond on cold mornings, ensured that no veteran seeking shelter or knowledge would be turned away unseen. Raymond himself had found a new home, a modest but tidy apartment in a veteran-supportive housing complex on the city's north side. The apartment, with its clean walls and sturdy furniture, was a far cry from the icy sidewalks and crowded shelters he'd known for years. A small window overlooked a courtyard where other veterans gathered to share stories or play cards, their laughter a reminder that community could heal wounds time had deepened. On Raymond's walls, once bare, hung framed photographs and documents chronicling a life reclaimed. A black and white image of a young soldier in Vietnam, his eyes bright with purpose, a certificate of his Silver Star, and a letter from Judge Nora Bennett, written in her precise hand, thanking him for the courage that had shaped her life. Each morning, Raymond sat at a small desk by the window, writing in a leather-bound journal, a gift from Bennett, that replaced the tattered notebook he'd once clutched. His doctors, part of the VA's specialized cognitive therapy program, encouraged the journaling as a way to externalize memories, to anchor fragments of a past that might otherwise slip away. The pages, filled with careful, deliberate script, were more than therapy. They were a legacy, destined for the National Veterans History Project archive, where Raymond's story would live alongside those of other unsung heroes. The courtroom where Judge Bennett had recognized her long-ago rescuer had also been transformed. Renamed Hayes Chamber, where justice rose to courage, it was now dedicated exclusively to veterans' cases, with trained advocates present at every hearing to ensure no one fell through the cracks. A bronze relief of Raymond's medallion, donated by a local artist, hung above the bench, its inscription echoing his quiet wisdom: "Listen before judging." The chamber was a beacon, a place where the system vowed to do better, to see the person behind the charges. Sarah Martinez, the law student whose quick research had helped uncover Raymond's identity, had changed her career trajectory because of that day. After graduating, she joined the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, specializing in cases involving traumatic brain injuries. Her office, a small space filled with files and dog-eared law books, was a shrine to advocacy, its walls adorned with articles about Raymond's case and a photo of him accepting his restored identity documents. When orienting new interns, Sarah would recount his story, her voice steady but passionate. "We don't judge people. We judge our incomplete understanding of them." Raymond taught me that. Judge Bennett, too, had been forever changed. She maintained regular contact with Raymond, joining him for coffee every other Sunday at a diner near his apartment. Their conversations were often quiet, punctuated by comfortable silences that spoke of a bond beyond words. Occasionally, she brought old photographs from Vietnam, historical archive images of villages, soldiers, and dusty roads, hoping to spark fragments of his memory. One Sunday, as they sat over steaming mugs, she showed him a photo of a medical outpost near Cam Ranh Bay, its makeshift tents dwarfed by the jungle. Raymond's eyes lingered on the image, his fingers tracing the outline of a culvert. "Scared eyes," he murmured, his voice soft but clear. "A little girl told her to be brave." Bennett's heart swelled, her hand reaching across the table to squeeze his. "You did more than tell me, Raymond. You carried me." Those moments, small but profound, were a lifeline for both of them, a reminder that some debts could never be repaid, but could be honored through connection. On the first anniversary of their courtroom reunion, local veterans organized a ceremony at the courthouse, a modest but heartfelt event that drew a diverse crowd. Grizzled Vietnam vets in faded caps, young soldiers in crisp uniforms, city officials, and ordinary Chicagoans moved by Raymond's story. The Hayes Chamber was packed, its wooden benches filled with faces reflecting hope, pride, and a shared commitment to change. A small podium stood at the front, flanked by American and POW MIA flags, their colors vivid against the room's muted tones. Raymond, dressed in a navy blazer provided by the VA, sat in the front row, his posture straighter than it had been in years, a flicker of his old military bearing visible through the weight of time. Beside him sat Judge Bennett, not in her judicial robe, but in a simple black dress, her presence that of a grateful friend rather than a presiding authority. The ceremony began with a speech from Colonel James Whitmore, the retired officer who'd confirmed Raymond's role in the classified Rising Fog operation. His voice, steady and commanding, recounted the mission's dangers, night raids, enemy fire, the desperate extraction of POWs, and Raymond's quiet heroism. "Staff Sergeant Hayes never sought recognition," Whitmore said, his eyes sweeping the room. But today, we give it to him, not just for what he did in Vietnam, but for what he's taught us about resilience, about honor, about never leaving a brother behind. The room erupted in applause, veterans standing to salute, their hands snapping to their foreheads with precision born of training and respect. When it was Raymond's turn to speak, he approached the podium hesitantly, his steps slow but deliberate. The crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on the man whose story had sparked a movement. He adjusted the microphone, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment, and looked out at the gathered faces. His words, carefully chosen, carried the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned to navigate around missing memories. A person's name, he began, his voice low but clear, is sometimes an entire history we haven't yet learned. The room absorbed the statement, its simplicity belying its profound truth. Heroes aren't always found on pedestals, he continued, his voice growing stronger. Sometimes they're sitting quietly in defendants' chairs, forgotten by the very world they helped protect. The words landed like a thunderclap, a call to see the unseen, to honor the overlooked. Judge Bennett, seated in the front row, nodded silently, tears glistening in her eyes. Raymond paused, his gaze sweeping the room, as if seeing not just the faces before him, but the brothers he'd lost in Vietnam, the children he'd saved, the life he'd pieced back together. Listen before judging, he said, his final words resonating with quiet power, for the silence of one who has endured may speak louder than any defense. The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that shook the chamber's walls, a collective acknowledgement of a truth that demanded to be heard. Those three reflections on names, heroes, and silence were later engraved in bronze at the entrance to the Veterans Justice Center, a new facility established in Raymond's name. The center, funded by a combination of city grants and private donations, was a hub for legal aid, mental health services, and job training, designed to catch veterans before they fell through the system's cracks. Its mission was simple but urgent, to ensure that no one like Raymond would ever be forgotten again. The bronze plaque, polished daily by a volunteer who'd served in Iraq, became a pilgrimage site for veterans, a place to reflect on sacrifice and second chances. Raymond's case had ripple effects far beyond the courthouse. The Chicago City Council, spurred by public outcry and media pressure, passed a resolution mandating regular audits of homeless services to identify veterans. The mayor's office, eager to capitalize on the story's positive momentum, implemented a policy requiring police to cross-check military service records before charging homeless individuals with minor offenses. The directive, dubbed the Hayes Protocol, was a small but meaningful step toward systemic change, a recognition that justice began with understanding. The most significant outcome, however, came from the Department of Veterans Affairs, which launched Operation Hayes, a nationwide initiative to identify and support veterans with cognitive impairments. The program, backed by federal funding and championed by advocates inspired by Raymond's story, trained caseworkers to navigate bureaucratic hurdles, ensured benefits were reinstated promptly, and provided tailored therapy for memory-related conditions. By its first year, Operation Hayes had reached over 2,000 veterans, reconnecting them with housing, healthcare, and dignity. Its logo, a stylized medallion inspired by the one Raymond had given Bennett, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most broken systems could be mended with enough will. Raymond's personal journey continued to evolve. His therapy at the VA Medical Center showed steady progress, with flashes of memory returning in vivid bursts, a comrade's laugh, the smell of jungle rain, the weight of a child in his arms. His physical health, bolstered by regular meals and a warm bed, improved markedly, his frail frame filling out, his hands steadier. He began volunteering at the library's Veterans Resource Program, sitting quietly with others who'd served, listening to their stories with the same patience he'd once shown on his bench. To them, he was no longer just Raymond. He was Staff Sergeant Hayes, a living testament to survival and redemption. Judge Bennett, reflecting on the year since their reunion, often spoke of Raymond in her speeches to law students and civic groups. His story isn't just about one man, she'd say, her voice firm. It's about what happens when we stop seeing people as problems and start seeing them as possibilities. Raymond reminded us that justice isn't just a verdict, it's a promise to do better. Her words, reprinted in op-eds and quoted on social media, fueled a broader conversation about veterans' rights, homelessness, and the moral obligations of a nation to those who serve. The media, which had initially seized on Raymond's story for its dramatic twist, continued to follow his progress, their coverage evolving from sensational headlines to thoughtful features. A PBS documentary, The Silent Hero, Raymond Hayes' Redemption, explored the systemic failures that led to his homelessness, interweaving interviews with Raymond, Bennett, and Sarah with archival footage of Vietnam. The film, which won a regional Emmy, ended with Raymond at his apartment desk, writing in his journal, his face lit by a quiet determination. "I don't remember everything," he said to the camera, "but I remember why I served. For the people who needed me. Maybe I still can." Social media kept the story alive, with #HonorHayes resurfacing whenever a new milestone was reached, a policy change, a veteran housed, a speech by Raymond. Veterans groups across the country adopted his story as a rallying cry, organizing fundraisers and awareness campaigns under banners like "No Veteran Left Behind." A Chicago high school named its annual Community Service Award after him, the Raymond Hayes Courage Award, given to students who exemplified resilience and compassion. Each recipient received a small medallion, a nod to the one that had connected Raymond and Bennett across decades. On a crisp spring morning, as cherry blossoms bloomed along the city's lakefront, Raymond returned to the library bench, not as a homeless man, but as a guest of honor. The library was unveiling a new wing, funded in part by donations inspired by his story, dedicated to veterans' education and job training. A small crowd gathered, library staff, veterans, local officials, and Judge Bennett, who stood beside him, her arm linked through his. Sarah, now a full-time advocate, introduced Raymond, her voice cracking with pride. "This man," she said, gesturing to him, "taught us that a name is more than a word. It's a story, a sacrifice, a call to action. Because of him, we're building a world where no veteran is forgotten." Raymond, unaccustomed to the spotlight, spoke briefly, his words carrying the weight of lived truth. "I never asked for this," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But if my story helps one person, one brother, one sister, find their way home, then it's worth telling." The applause was thunderous, a celebration not just of Raymond, but of the countless others his story had touched. Bennett, standing beside him, whispered, "You're still saving people, Raymond." He nodded, a faint smile breaking through, the first she'd seen in months. As the ceremony ended, Raymond lingered by the bench, his fingers tracing the plaque's inscription. A young veteran, recently discharged and struggling to adjust, approached him, hesitant but drawn by the stories he'd heard. "How did you keep going?" he asked, his voice raw. Raymond looked at him, his eyes clear and steady. "You remember the ones who didn't make it," he said. "You carry them with you. That's what keeps you moving." The young man nodded, tears in his eyes, and walked away with a new resolve, a piece of Raymond's strength now his own. The legacy of Raymond L. Hayes is not just in the policies changed or the buildings named. It's in the quiet moments, Sarah mentoring a new intern, Bennett sharing coffee with a man who saved her, a veteran finding a home because someone listened. It's in the stories we tell, the names we honor, the silences we learn to hear. His life, once a whisper in Chicago's shadows, became a shout that woke a nation, a reminder that justice, though delayed, is never absent. So let his story be your call, to stand firm when the world turns away, to see the hero in the stranger, to fight for those who fought for us. Share this truth, carry it forward, and never let a name or a sacrifice be forgotten.